So hi everyone, welcome to this session about the language server protocol. I am Miro from a company named Typefox.
And I'm Sven, also from Typefox. And so this session is kind of an extension to the keynote we saw earlier. We didn't know what would kind of be the content of the keynote, so we kind of need to adjust a bit to that, such that I guess no one was in the keynote maybe. Who was there? Okay, that's good. So then let's go into more depth of what the language server protocol is and why it is important not only for VSCode people, but also for others in the world. So if you don't know, we've been working on Eclipse technology for many years, and maybe most importantly on Xtext, which is a framework for language development, and which is the main motivation why this stuff is interesting for us. I would like to start with some kind of motivation. This is a quote by Anders Heisberg. Anders Heisberg is a language designer or behind C#, TypeScript. He did also Delphi. He works for Microsoft. And this is a very, very nice interview he gave in August, published on Channel 9, very recommended to watch, where he's talking about modern compiler construction. And so the interview starts with kind of like they showing this Dragon book, this old compiler book, 30 years old, and Anders claims that this is not how we do it today, right? Because he says, over the last decade, we've become very accustomed to IDEs and powerful editors, and all this stuff underneath the covers, like completion, find references, and so on, that is powered by compilers. And so, but these compilers are what he called modern compilers, not these old-fashioned kind of, I have correct input, and all I need to do is to create something that I can execute. But I have to deal with incomplete, corrupt input, and on the way, I need to provide all kinds of services to tools and IDs. I mean, one of the first of these kind of modern compilers is, in fact, the Eclipse Java compiler. And the reason they did it 15 years ago was that the Sun compiler was an old-fashioned compiler, which couldn't kind of provide any kind of tool support. And so they knew already, because they had experience with other languages like Smalltalk and so on, that it would be really important to know stuff about AST and so on if you want to have decent tool support. And since there is no way to get that, or it's not easy to get that from the Java compiler, they re-implemented a compiler, which seems to be a lot of work. And so, but it kind of resulted in a very nice, fast, incremental compiler that can be used to do also kind of sport other tools, actually. Like, it is used in IntelliJ IDEA sometimes. I mean, IDEA, actually, they have re-implemented most of the compiler stuff themselves. So, like, for the tooling, they have their own stuff. But as we saw today in the demo, you can now use the Eclipse compiler in VSCode through the language server protocol. And that's Java, right? I mean, Java is very, very popular. But there are more languages. And so I'm also working on programming languages. And like the reason we built Xtext in the first place is because it's always so such a lot of work to have a language and tool support. But if you don't have tool support, no one wants to use your language these days. So you need to have that. And so what the scheme is that if you have a popular language, others take care of the tool support. If you have a non-popular, you have to do it your own. So it's kind of unfair because you are weaker anyway, and you have to do more work. So what we did, we as Eclipse community, I'm not talking about the Java people, but when we want to build language support in Eclipse, we almost always kind of re-implement a lot of bits of a compiler because we need that stuff in order to provide decent tool support. And so there is many, many, many lines of code out there that kind of do similar things that the original compiler of a certain language does, maybe in a different language and so on. And then once you have that, then you have tool support for Eclipse. And then, you know, Eclipse is really nice. We all love it. But also, there is some people who say, well, maybe in 10 years, people use different editors or so. Or you have a mixed team, like 50% use IntelliJ IDEA, others use Eclipse. So you need to have 2 plugins and so on. And yeah, you know, there's a lot of editors. So then also Dirk mentioned this, like he had this graph where on the left-hand side we had like simple editors, right-hand side we had IDEs. I would put it like there is a good enough approach that is generic editing facilities plus some language-specific configuration for syntax coloring. I mean, mostly, maybe not bracket matching or something like that, or snippets, but that's it. There is very popular language configuration format out there that is the TM language grammar TextMate that is supported by different editors, actually. VSCode also supports that. And there is, if you look at GitHub, there's many, many, many configuration files for that. So it makes sense in your IDE to support this format, then you have a lot of syntax coloring and stuff like that. But of course, it's not enough for us. So the approach Anders Heisberg uses, or like kind of advertises, is you use that, and then as soon as you need something more kind of, something that actually needs an abstract syntax tree, basically, or as soon as it goes into parsing, then you ask, ideally you ask the compiler, a modern compiler that can provide you all these services. And there are such compilers, like for instance, the TypeScript compiler supports language services. They have their own format, which you can use, and a lot of tools use that. Like, for instance, also WebStorm from JetBrains, I use it. This is VSCode. Then there is Turn.js. I think we also use it in Eclipse, like in Orion, I think it's wrapped and enhanced. And like this is a it's not a compiler because JavaScript doesn't need to be compiled, but it is a code analysis engine, basically the same. It parses JavaScript, does control flow analysis, infers types as much as possible, and provides tool support in terms of services headlessly. So you can reuse that. Or OmniSharp, which is a wrapper around the Roslyn modern compiler they have for C# and so on. That's an open source project. They, again, have defined their own kind of protocol, so to say. And so what do they do if they want to have tool support? Of course, they build plugins for every kind of editor, and they have to maintain it and so on, because these editors don't talk their stuff, you know? And we kind of have the same problem or situation with Xtext. So Xtext, if you build a language, implement it in Xtext, then you can use it in Eclipse, you can use it in IntelliJ IDEA, you can use it in Orion or Ace or Code Miro. But the Xtext project needs to maintain all these bindings because there is no standard protocol supported by the editors. The language server protocol is just that, the idea to have kind of a common protocol that language compilers support, and on the other hand, editors support. And then hopefully you can just plug and play, and you get decent tool support. Like you build a language, for instance, with Xtext, and you implement it once, and then you can use it in all kinds of different editors, whatever seems fit for you. That's the idea behind that. And that's our kind of viewpoint or motivation. Like we look from that. We want to have as many editors supporting that. On the other hand side, the GitHub, the VS Code people would like to have many languages. I think there is a big synergy there. So this is a URL for the protocol. Actually, we checked this morning, and I was saying, like, I'm not sure if the VS Code bit is still there. Maybe they changed the URL.
Yes, right. The URL should
Yeah. They silently changed the URL. Is that even possible with GitHub repository? I didn't know. So maybe try both, or use Google. Right, with that, I think we can go to some demos, such that you get an impression of what can be done. Of course, like we wanted to start with the demo showing VSCode and the Eclipse JDT plugin. But since we had that already, I'll just skip it. Or is there questions to that? By the way, if you have questions in between or so, we will go through the protocol in more depth in a second. Just raise your hand. We can just discuss it right away. OK, so what you see here is an application or product we've been working on that highly leverages the language server protocol. So we couldn't have done this, basically, in that time without the language server protocol. It is a data science IDE or data analytics. So you wrangle data and try to come up with reasonable reports as a result. It's so-called cloud IDE that is kind of, you can run it in Docker images and so on. And it supports currently 2 languages. That is Python and R. Has anybody, yeah, I guess most don't know R. It is a very specific language, like it's a very generic language actually, but only used in the data science world mostly. So, but these guys, they build everything. It's very similar to JavaScript. They build everything with R there. So we implemented R in Xtext and provided through a language server, and then we use the Monaco editor widget Dirk was mentioning before. So if we were using VSCode, we couldn't build an application because that's not a platform, you know. But the editor widget, it's just like the Orion widget or Ace or Code Miro. We can embed in any kind of web application or any web context. And it fully supports the language server protocol, like these APIs we've seen also in code. And so this is some R code here. We have some functions defined. I have another file here. What I can do is I can source this line I'm selecting. That means it kicks off a so-called kernel. The stuff is built on something called UpyLab. And UpyLab also has some sort of abstraction, like the language server protocol, not over compilers, but over REPLs. So in data science, you often kind of interact with data incrementally. So you have data in some REPL, and then you do some expression and check the data, how does it look like, and you need to clean it up and so on. And you do it in a kind of REPL fashion. And the kernel is a standard abstract protocol which you can use. And so we have a Python kernel, we have an R kernel using the same kind of interface. All right, so what I could, for instance, do here is import this file I have, and then I could, for instance, call a method that is do some plotting. And a feature, like you see that it's code completion and stuff, find reference, that all works. A feature that I really like also that has not been mentioned is these signature provider stuff. That's pretty cool because like when you're in a function and you want to provide parameters, especially in Java, it's super nice if you see all the overloads and can kind of tell what is the argument I have to provide here and there. And so in R, there's no overloads, but there are named parameters. So for instance, if I first provide the second argument, you see it highlights the right one. Once I press a comma, it goes back and tells me, oh, now you should do this stuff here. And then again, I could press Shift-Enter. I first need to source its stuff. And then I can execute this function, and it gives me some nice result of some strange volcano example data I don't understand. Also, there's other languages like variants we have implemented, also again using the language server protocol. This is our Markdown. What this does is it is Markdown, but it also has embedded R expressions. So when I save, it generates me the HTML report, and then I can kind of see that that's the result, and I can kind of change it, and it updates unsafe and so on. So I use this kind of safe cycle we have also in Eclipse. Okay, so that's a product which should show you that you can really leverage this stuff in your own applications. Similarly to like you did with Eclipse RCP, whenever you need a language, you can build this stuff also with web applications. For instance, you could also use Eclipse Shay or Eclipse Orion, which is both support the language server protocol or going to support it. For the other demo, I hand over to Miro.
Yeah, thanks, Sven. For the second demo, we would like to present a different technology stack that still involves the language server protocol, obviously. What I like about this demo is, for one thing, it was relatively little work to set it up because it was mostly about plugging together things that are available there. And so, for example, so one thing is on the client side, again, it's Monaco, but this time embedded in a very simple HTML page. So this should just show you, you can use this as a kind of widget and put it in kind of any form of web context. And on the back end, here we have an Xtext language. So a very simple one that describes mathematical expressions, so similar to Java expressions. And so it was very easy to generate a language infrastructure from our language definition, plug it together with the Monaco editor with the language server protocol. So what we can do in this language is define functions, like here a square function, a circle area function, and variables, here are A and R. And then we can write expressions that operate on these previous definitions and also predefined constants and functions. And I can evaluate them in lines. So this is, by the way, available online. You will find it on monaco-demo.typefox.io. So we're currently in the process to set up some different kind of examples there. So maybe I have to...
We could prove whether Dirk's sentiment about you can't do that on the server holds. Could you please try all? No, it's not. It's a very weak Amazon node, so it doesn't even kind of stand one user, actually, I think.
So here, if I go to the end of one expression line, I hit and I type Shift-Enter. This expression line is inline evaluated on the server using stuff that we implemented on top of Xtext. And I can do the same for the second evaluation, clear the evaluations, continue typing. I get content assist for it. So you see here I have the variable A that is defined above. I have predefined functions from Java Lang Math. So, and we have nice features like the highlighting of occurrences and jumping to the definition. So if I hit Command click on this A, the cursor jumps over here, and we have the validation of cross-references. So if I change the name of it, I will see all the previous references to A and cannot be resolved, and so on. So if you know Xtext, you already know these features, and here in this case, these features are provided through the language server protocol in the middle.
One important extension maybe I would like to point out is that with this web technology, stuff like inlining, super nice HTML widget, like we are in the web there and we can do any kind of rendering right in the editor. Like the Monaco editor, for instance, supports that. Other editors support that as well. So you're very flexible, and like, you know, these ideas about projectional editing and stuff like that, that's pretty easy UI-wise with this stuff. Like, you have the full web technology at your fingertips.
Good. Next, I would like to go a little bit into details of the protocol itself. I won't list all the available requests or anything that you can just look up in the documentation. Here, it's more about understanding some of the concepts that are not obvious, maybe. So one of the first things, a little bit of this has already been explained by Dirk in his keynote. So for example, so if we take a client on the left side and the server on the right side, so the first interaction between the two is the client has to connect somehow to the server, and the server will run in some kind of separate component. As Dirk always mentioned, a separate process, so this is usually the case for VS Code. It is the case for that. It doesn't have to be necessarily a process, but somehow this protocol is designed in a way that it can and maybe should be disconnected from the main application. And in between, we have JSON RPC messages. So this is just a protocol for remote procedure call that is based on JSON. And so, for example, from TypeScript, you can there's a library where you can just very comfortably call procedures that will then and they will be translated into JSON and executed on the server. So, and after this connection, one of the first message that is sent is an initialization that basically informs the client what the server is able to provide. So it is, for example, possible for the server to provide only one single feature, like only validating the files and providing error warnings, markers for the editors, and nothing else. That's okay. And as Dirk pointed out, so the client can connect to multiple language servers and merge their possibilities. Then a very important concept is that both client and server are assumed to be able to have access to a shared workspace. In the case of VS Code, this is just a directory that contains your workspace, your project, so to call. And so the client is always the one who will read the files when the user opens it, write it when the user hits Control or Command S. But the server also may be able to read or must be able to read them, for example, in order to resolve cross-references to other files. So the client keeps the language server informed about which are the files that are currently opened by the user. So all these basic file operations are reported via notifications. So opening, modifying a file, saving, and closing. This is also important because if you open and modify a file, you have a dirty state in that file, and that has to may have to be considered in the language server when it comes to cross-file referencing and so on. Then there's quite a lot of messaging that takes place on a request-response scheme. So most notably, maybe the completion proposals that are requested by the client as soon as the user hits control space. And obviously, the server then returns a list of proposals, which may be empty. And there's a second scheme based on notifications. And the important thing to note here is that both client and server can start a notification without prior or changing connection, so that the server can, on its own, send a list of diagnostics after a validation run to the client at any time. So this means that this server is not a server in the classical sense of a web server, because it's not only the client who can initiate messaging, but also the language server. And yeah, one question? Well, no, for VS Code, this here runs on a separate process, and it's just done via standard input-output. Yeah. So no, yeah, just standard input-output of that process. Yes. You can, of course, also use a socket. So, and if you do it remotely, you can use some WebSocket for that. But just standard HTTP would not work. Yeah, because the server then has no way to initiate a messaging to the client, right? Yeah.
So when you type and you haven't saved and you do code completion, how does the language server know the state of your file? Do you have to save first, or does it get the dirty state of the editor?
Yes, this modify notification. So,
but the editor has to save, so to say, on every keystroke, so that the language...
No, not to save. So, of course, the language server can synchronize through the file system, but that doesn't work for files that are only have a state that is only memory. For that reason, there's a modification notification, and that has I think two or three different flavors. Either the client sends incremental updates, so if you type something, only the new text is sent to the server, or the whole text at once. So you can choose one of these schemes. Yeah, of course, that has to be considered by the server. So the server itself has to duplicate this, the current dirty state of the editor, and use that one as a reference, both for all the services that run on that file, and also for services for other files. Like for Java, you might, maybe, so you might want to run validation again on other files. Well, that's not usually not always done, so this dirty state handling is quite a complex topic, how far you want to push that, but you can choose how to do that on the server side. Good. I would like to announce a new Eclipse project at this occasion. It's called LSP4j. This is a Java implementation of the language server protocol that provides Java data structure for the messages that are defined by the protocol, so that you get statically typed messages that you can construct and use them for sending to the other side, and then you receive again an instance of the result object, and an API for implementing language servers, for example. So it's just an interface that has all the kind of messages that are possible between client and server. So you can either use that interface to implement a specific server, or there's also an endpoint implementation for the client, so that just hides a remote server behind this interface and internally just wraps all the method calls into JSON messages. So the whole JSON parsing and serialization. So we just currently use Google JSON for that. Is also done by this protocol, so including kind of the managing of these messages. So this project is currently in IP review, so there's no GitHub repository yet for it, but there is an initial code base from which we will initialize the repository, and that has been taken from a previous open source project that we started at Typefox a few months ago. That's called LS API, and that's already used in some language server implementations or clients. For example, I think the Eclipse generic editor uses that one, right? I think there will be a talk about that tomorrow. We will reference that later. And yeah, so we hope that we can start quite soon to set up the repository and start on that project, and actually quite excited to get this new project moving on and have many other Eclipse-based projects maybe build on this as a library. So it will really be a kind of a self-contained Java library without Eclipse UI dependencies or so. So here's just a small example how it could look like to use it. So if you, for example, are on the client side and want to invoke code completion after the user has hit control space, you could say you have a language server, which could be just a wrapper around the messaging, and you say get text document service do completion with this parameter, which basically contains reference to the document and a position, so where is the cursor currently. And here we use an API that is taken or derived from the Java 8 completable future. Maybe some of you have already used that, which gives us the asynchronous message processing. So this lambda here is executed as soon as a result object is received from the remote side. When we have the result, we can display them in our client. So this is one example for that. So the text message that is sent to the could look like this. So this would be a typical code completion proposal. So here there's a method field that says what kind of request is this, and the parameters include the text document reference and a position which says which line, which character. Good. This is a screenshot from the GitHub page of the language server protocol. There's a wiki page that is updated quite regularly whenever new implementations are added by someone. So, for example, you see here the Java implementation that was already mentioned in the keynote. And there's also Xtext on the list. So we have our own language server that can be used for any kind of Xtext-based language and be connected in that way. So this is already quite a remarkable list, I would say. And on the client side, we have these. This is what is already listed there. So VSCode obviously was the first one. Eclipse Shade, there was a talk yesterday about Shade that mentioned their efforts into supporting this. So this is quite cool. And for the Eclipse IDE, there will be a talk tomorrow at 11, I think. So about what has already been done there to support this protocol in Eclipse editor. And what is not listed on there now is the Orion efforts. This will be a talk today at 5, which could also be interesting. But I should also mention that at the same time, there's a really cool talk about code generation by my colleagues. So Christian. Good. I will hand over.
Okay. So some kind of like last slides where we would like to discuss some open questions. For instance, currently the language server protocol kind of supports the stuff that is covered in VSCode. And as you learned earlier, they don't want to be a full-blown IDE. So they lack some features which we would consider very important, like call hierarchy, type hierarchy, semantic coloring is missing. Like we discussed it also with just before the talk with Dirk, and he said whether they build it into VS Code or not is independent of whether they put it into the protocol. So, right? So they are open to these kind of extensions. But then also an interesting point is, or a question we often hear is, okay, so this is kind of covering the 80%, that the common denominator between all languages and tools. But what about the kind of my language special thing? Like, for instance, we saw this evaluation of expressions, right? That's not something that is common for all languages. So the protocol is designed in a way that you can extend it and add through methods. Of course, you need to take care that the tool and the language server understand each other, for sure. But then that's the main idea. So you get the 80% with the protocol, and then you can add to that. Another thing that came up is the idea of how do I install such a plugin? Currently, it's a language server, and then you need to have this additional configuration. Because, for instance, syntax coloring, which is the next point, these good enough configuration I mentioned earlier, like TM grammars for syntax coloring, that's not part of the language server. So if you install a language server, you don't have syntax coloring. It's kind of strange, isn't it? So not, at least not for the end user, something they would expect. So how does an end user install a new language support? And of course, every system has their own plugin mechanism somehow. But wouldn't it be nice if I could just kind of deploy my language to some sort of standard language server registry, and then the different tools would look it up there, and it would be self-contained? So that's stuff that could be discussed, and there's different people interested in that. So this is the bug number 76 if you want to join in there. Yeah, what we expect from all this is more kind of less duplication of code, basically. Easier transition between different tool generations for we decouple basically the tool stuff and the language life cycles, and so yeah, better also interconnection between projects there at that point. And so best thing that we can all do is kind of try to engage with that and see how we can leverage it, like from the tool side or from the language server side. I did a ticket for JetBrains, just in case someone wants to vote for that. I think that would be a good idea. But yeah, maybe that's not like, maybe that's also then an advantage for Eclipse. With that, yeah, spread the word about it and try it out. Evaluate the session. We have some time left for question, I guess. 1 minute or what? Yeah. Are there any questions? Yeah, Stefan? So what about complex refactorings that are based on semantic modification? That means you transform the AST and then serialize the stuff back, right? That's what you mean? You would do that all on the language server side, and then you just send over the text changes.
And if we think of something that requires a wizard with some visual interaction to insert...
Then it's multiple requests to the language server. And it's an extension, a very specific extension, because kind of pull-up refactoring, for instance, is nothing that you can do in R because there are not even classes. You know, that's, yeah. And then, yeah, if you want to have all these fancy things, then you need to